A McDonald's at midnight is never entirely empty, yet it always feels as though it should be. The bright yellow glow of the arches visible from the highway promises warmth, safety, and something familiar. Travelers, night shift workers, and drifters slip through its doors searching for food and a brief place of belonging. Yet beneath that comfort lies another truth. Places that never sleep are also places where silence learns to live. Strange things linger when doors are left open to anyone at any hour. A restaurant filled with light becomes far more dangerous than the dark woods that surround it. One story begins not with a scream, but with the absence of sound. A worker on the overnight shift remembered how the hum of the soda machine cut off suddenly, as though a switch had been flipped somewhere deep inside the walls. For a moment there was nothing, no fryer, no drive-through buzz, no sound at all. In that silence she thought she heard breathing. She turned, expecting to find a customer, but the dining room was empty. The chairs had already been placed upside down on the tables. The floor glistened faintly with mop water, yet something about the air felt occupied. It pressed against her chest in a way that felt personal, intimate, as if someone unseen had leaned in too close. She was not the first to notice it. Across the country in countless small towns, late-night staff whispered about the same feeling, that McDonald's after midnight seemed to hold its breath. Some joked that the restaurants became different places when the clock moved past 12. Others stopped joking after hearing a sound that was too distinct to ignore. A cough from the bathroom when the doors had been locked hours before. A chair scraping against the tiles when no one had moved. A reflection in the window that did not belong to anyone standing there. It is easy to dismiss such things as tricks of exhaustion. Late shifts wear the mind down, and loneliness paints its own hallucinations. Yet there were stories too consistent, too sharp to fade away. One former customer swore that as he bit into his sandwich he saw in the corner of his vision a man seated in the far booth. The man appeared in the glass reflection of the window, yet when the customer turned, the booth was empty. He did not finish his meal. He walked out into the night and drove away without looking back. The restaurant, he later said, felt like it had swallowed something alive. The coldest detail in these stories is not what was seen, but what was felt. There is a weight that follows you down the hallway toward the restroom. There is the sense that eyes study you when you linger too long near the back counter. One worker recalled how she heard her name whispered from the freezer, the syllables dragged low and heavy, though no one else was on shift with her. She told herself it was the ice machine shifting, until she heard it again, clearer, spoken like a memory she had never wanted. There is something uniquely unsettling about horror in brightly lit spaces. Shadows are expected to hold secrets, but the fluorescent light of a fast food dining room leaves no place to hide. That leaves only one possibility, that the thing you fear is standing in the open, visible to everyone, yet still unseen. A booth that looks empty may not be empty at all. A smile from the other end of the counter may not belong to a face you will ever recognize again. The fear multiplies when you consider the nature of places like this. McDonald's is not a home, nor is it entirely public. It is a liminal zone, a waiting area where hundreds of strangers pass through every day. The staff never know who will walk through the door at 2 a.m. They never know if the man ordering coffee is on his way to work or on his way from something far worse. They never know if the woman staring at the menu is deciding between fries or simply measuring how far the exit is if she needs to run. Even police have admitted that fast food chains are magnets for strange encounters. The doors stay open, the lights stay on. Something about that combination draws not only the living, but perhaps something else. The places that refuse to sleep are the places most likely to be visited by things that never rest. So the stories continue. A night manager counting bills in the back office heard the drive-through speaker crackle to life. A voice whispered through the static asking for help. Yet the cameras showed no car outside and the order screen remained blank. Another worker sweeping the front lobby swore she felt a hand brush across her shoulder. She dropped the broom and spun around. No one stood there. The hand had been too heavy, too deliberate to be air. The hook of it all, the part that unsettles even the most rational mind, is that none of these stories end with discovery. There is no one pulled out from behind a door, no trespasser caught, no culprit revealed. Instead, there is only the haunting question that keeps returning. If nothing human was there, then what was? And why does it choose a place so ordinary, so familiar, as its ground to stand on? It is in the absence of answers that the fear grows. The McDonald's at midnight is not remembered for laughter or comfort food, but for the way silence presses its weight against every surface. as though the building itself waits for something to happen again. And when you drive past those glowing arches late at night, do you ever wonder what waits inside? Do you ever wonder if someone is sitting in the booth nearest the door, watching, smiling faintly as though they already know your name? McDonald's was built on the promise of familiarity. No matter the town, no matter the hour, the doors opened to the same warm smell of fries, the same hum of machines, the same golden glow that spilled across the parking lot like a beacon. For decades, travelers trusted it. Parents brought children for birthday parties. Teenagers lingered in the booths long after they finished their food, using the restaurant as a place to escape their homes. At night it became something else, a lighthouse for the restless and the lost. Truck drivers pulling off the interstate at midnight, factory workers who had just finished their shifts, couples who needed a quiet corner to sit in until the city felt safe again. It was more than a restaurant. It was a space between worlds, bright enough to hold off the night but never strong enough to erase it completely. In certain towns, especially the ones where the roads cut through long stretches of darkness, McDonald's was the only place that stayed open. The gas stations locked their doors. The grocery store closed its gates. Even the bars grew silent after last call. But the restaurant kept its lights burning, a promise that someone somewhere was awake. That should have been comforting. Instead, for those who worked there, it became a burden. When you are the only place left open in a sleeping town, you are forced to see the things that the night tries to hide. The employees knew this better than anyone. Ask any of them and they would tell you that the daytime rush was chaos, but it was the kind of chaos that made sense. Children crying, cash registers ringing, the endless crackle of fryers and timers. At night, however, there was a different rhythm. The rush would fade to nothing. The bright dining room, built for hundreds, sat empty. The employees moved slower, listening to their own footsteps on tile floors. Every sound stretched longer, sharper, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Those who stayed for years began to notice patterns. The same people returned night after night, not for food, but for something else. The man who sat in the corner booth staring at the parking lot with a cup of coffee he never finished. The woman who paced the hallway to the bathroom, her shoes clicking steadily until she stepped inside and never returned to the dining room. Staff swore they saw her leave, yet her food remained untouched on the table. And then there were the people who seemed less like customers and more like shadows, drifting between the tables, their faces never quite visible under the fluorescent light. Local teenagers told their own stories. Some said the restaurant had been built on the edge of something old, a field where fires once burned. Others claimed that years before, long before the bright colors and the golden arches, the land had been the site of a small diner where something terrible had happened. Rumors shifted with every telling. A robbery gone wrong, a missing person found in the freezer, a worker who vanished in the middle of a shift and was never seen again. No one could prove any of it. Yet the whispers grew until they became part of the identity of the place. People could not look at the bright arches without remembering that it had its own buried history. For staff, the weight of the night shift became more than exhaustion. It became dread. They would finish wiping down the counters and find fresh handprints pressed into the glass doors. They would sweep the floor and find a pair of wet footprints that stretched from the lobby to the bathroom, even when no one had entered for hours. Sometimes the soda machine would dispense on its own, spilling into empty cups that no one had placed. The workers tried to laugh it off. Machines malfunction, floors hold moisture, and eyes play tricks in the dead of night. But the laughter always ended too quickly. The worst of it was not what they saw, but what they felt. They spoke of being watched from the parking lot, though no cars sat outside. They spoke of a presence behind them when they locked the office door, so heavy that they felt it brush their necks. Some refused to close alone. They waited for others, insisting it was not safe to be the last one inside. For the community, the restaurant became both a necessity and a source of unease. Parents still took their children there during the day, but when darkness fell, they avoided the parking lot. The regulars who stopped in after midnight did so quietly, never lingering longer than necessary. They did not talk about what they saw. They did not explain why they always chose a booth near the exit. But there was an understanding, silent but shared. Everyone felt that something else had claimed the restaurant after midnight, and everyone was learning to live with it. The bright yellow arches promised normality, routine, comfort. Yet the truth was that behind that glow, behind the constant hum of machinery, there was a silence that waited. It stretched across the tiles, sat heavy in the booths, lingered behind the counters. It was not the silence of a closed building, but the silence of something listening, something patient, a silence that had grown familiar to those who worked there, yet never safe. And that silence was about to turn into something else, something no one could ignore. It began with small disturbances, the kind of moments that could be ignored if someone tried hard enough. A light flickering above the kitchen sink, a drive-through headset crackling though no one was outside, the smell of something faintly burning even when every fryer was clean and empty. The night shift workers brushed it away, telling themselves it was stress, the natural decay of a building that never slept. But denial can only carry so far, and eventually, the strangeness demanded attention. One worker recalled the first night she truly felt that something was wrong. She had been mopping the lobby floor after the last customer left. The chairs had been stacked neatly on the tables, and the air carried that heavy quiet that always fell after 2 a.m. She bent to wring out the mop, and when she straightened again, she noticed one of the chairs had been pulled back down from the table. It stood perfectly upright, as though waiting for someone to sit. She froze, eyes sweeping across the dining room. Every other chair remained stacked. Only this one had been moved. She did not hear the sound of it being lifted, nor the scrape of its legs across the tiles. It had simply been placed there silently, while her back was turned. Others began to speak of footsteps. In the back hallway leading to the restroom, they heard the sharp rhythm of shoes against tile, always walking just a step behind them. When they turned, the hall stretched empty, lit with sterile fluorescent light that revealed no one. One worker swore she felt the brush of fabric against her arm as she stepped inside the restroom, as if someone had slipped past her at the last second. But when she looked in the mirror above the sink, she saw nothing. No reflection beside hers, only her own pale face drained of all color, eyes fixed on a space that should not have been empty. The unease spread to customers. A young man who stopped for food late after work told staff he saw someone sitting in the booth across from him. At first it was a vague outline, a shadow in the corner of his vision. He looked up, expecting to meet a stranger's gaze, but the booth was empty. He laughed quietly to himself, shaking his head, and returned to his meal. Yet when he raised his eyes again, he saw the figure reflected in the window. It sat perfectly still, facing him, though the booth itself remained unoccupied. He left his food untouched and walked out without saying a word. Stranger still were the stories from the drive-thru. One night, an employee heard the familiar chime of the speaker. She lifted her headset and asked for the order. The line crackled. Then a voice whispered a single word she could not fully make out. It was low, drawn out, distorted. She leaned closer, asking the voice to repeat. The sound came again, quieter this time, and then nothing. She checked the monitor, expecting to see a car waiting outside. The screen was blank. The lot was empty. Yet the headset remained warm against her ear, as if someone still breathed through the other side. The surveillance cameras offered no comfort. In fact, they deepened the mystery. Frames skipped. Shadows stretched longer than they should have. On one recording, a worker cleaning the counter suddenly froze. Her head turned sharply toward the dining room, eyes widening as though she had seen something. She stood still for almost a full minute, before dropping the rag and rushing into the back. But on the tape, the space she had been staring at was empty. No figure, no movement, only an unoccupied dining room frozen in cold light. Not all details were visible. Some were heard. Whispers from the freezer that sounded like names. A cough from the back hallway when the doors were locked. Laughter that echoed faintly from the playground outside, even when the swing stood motionless and no children had been there for hours. These sounds came suddenly, clear enough that no one could mistake them for imagination. Yet when the employees checked, there was never a source. The buildup of unease took a toll on the staff. They worked faster, hurrying through their tasks, avoiding long pauses where the silence felt thick enough to swallow them whole. No one lingered alone in the dining room. They avoided looking too long into the glass windows, afraid of what they might see reflected back. Some began quitting without explanation, walking out mid-shift and never returning. Others stayed but carried the weight of growing fear, whispering to one another about what they had seen but never daring to say too much. Customers, too, began to notice. A family traveling through one night pulled into the lot, their children excited for fries. But when they stepped inside, the father froze. He later told friends that the restaurant felt wrong, as though every corner of the building had been hollowed out. He said the booths looked occupied even when empty, that the shadows in the dining room seemed to breathe. He took his children back to the car and drove away, leaving behind the smell of food and the eerie silence of the restaurant. The mystery grew layer by layer, with no explanation that satisfied the unease. Electrical issues did not explain the chairs moving. Exhaustion did not explain footprints appearing across freshly mopped floors. And imagination did not explain the reflection of figures seen in glass when no one sat in the booth. Each event built upon the last until the workers no longer questioned whether the stories were real. The only question left was why. Why here in this ordinary place? Why did something unseen choose a fast food restaurant as its ground to walk? The bright arches still glowed above the building, promising safety to anyone passing on the road. But inside, the promise was hollow. Inside, the air carried secrets too heavy to ignore. The buildup was slow, deliberate, like something gathering its strength. And everyone who felt it understood one truth: this was only the beginning. The stories alone might have faded into rumor if not for the fragments of evidence that surfaced over time. Each account on its own could be dismissed as exhaustion, imagination, or coincidence. Yet when the reports were placed side by side, the patterns became impossible to ignore. The strange disturbances were not isolated. They repeated across nights, across shifts, across different locations, as though something hidden followed the glow of the arches themselves. One of the most unsettling pieces of evidence came from a set of security tapes. A night manager, weary of constant complaints from staff, decided to review the footage himself. Hours of grainy black and white recordings revealed nothing unusual at first. Workers cleaning, customers drifting in and out, the usual restless activity of a building that never closed. But then the frames began to skip. Whole seconds disappeared, leaving gaps where movement should have continued. Chairs that had been stacked one moment appeared scattered across the floor the next. A mop bucket rolled across the dining room, though no one was near it. When the manager tried to rewind, the tape glitched, freezing on an image of the dining room that seemed wrong. The lights burned too brightly, bleaching the space until the walls appeared almost white, and in the far booth, a shadow sat that had no source. Employees added their own testimony. One worker described hearing her name whispered from the freezer. She had thought at first that it was another staff member playing a joke, but when she turned the corner, the corridor was empty. The sound came again, closer this time, drawn low and slow, dragging across the syllables like a memory pulled from deep water. She refused to go back inside the freezer for weeks afterward. Another employee told of cleaning the play area when he heard laughter. It was not the sharp, high-pitched sound of children, but something lower, stretched out like the imitation of a child's voice by someone who had never been young. The playground was empty, the door locked, yet the laughter continued until he fled into the dining room. Objects, too, seemed to behave strangely. Fresh handprints appeared on the glass doors after they had been cleaned. The size varied, some small like a child's, others wide and heavy, pressed hard enough that the glass rattled faintly when touched. One worker swore that she watched a ketchup packet slide across the counter on its own, as though an invisible hand had brushed it aside. Customers reported that the soda machines dispensed without anyone pressing the lever, the stream of liquid filling empty cups that no one had placed beneath. Explanations were attempted, but each came undone under scrutiny. Malfunctioning cameras could not explain why only certain frames skipped, always when the dining room was empty. Electrical issues could not explain the sound of voices calling names, nor the clear reflection of figures in glass when no one was present. Even trespassing seemed unlikely. The doors locked, alarms remained silent, and no signs of forced entry ever appeared. It was as if the disturbances came not from outside, but from the air within the building itself. Some began to look for deeper meaning. A local historian spoke of the land where the restaurant stood. Long before fast food chains, before neon lights, it had been farmland. There were rumors of fires, of barns burning with no clear cause, of people who disappeared and were never found. But the records were thin, the stories fragmented. Still, the thought lingered. Perhaps the ground itself carried something restless, something that refused to be buried by the construction of walls and tiles. Psychologists who heard the accounts offered their own theories. They spoke of exhaustion, of the effects of long shifts and isolation. They suggested that the workers projected their fears into the environment, transforming ordinary sounds into threats. But the problem with this theory was the consistency. Different people at different times described the same events, the same booth that appeared occupied in reflections, the same footsteps following down the hallway, the same laughter echoing from empty corners. Too many witnesses carried too much of the same story for it to be dismissed as coincidence. There were artifacts, too, small details that lingered even after the events had passed. A photograph taken in the dining room one evening showed a blurred face near the edge of the frame, though no one remembered anyone standing there. A receipt printed with letters smudged in a way that seemed deliberate, the ink forming the vague shape of a word: stay. A voicemail left on the restaurant's phone after hours that contained only breathing, heavy and uneven, lasting for nearly a full minute before the line cut off. These were fragments without context, pieces of a puzzle that refused to align, but together they painted a picture that felt too deliberate to ignore. The conflicting data deepened the mystery. Rational explanations struggled against testimonies that were too sharp, too personal. Every new piece of evidence only made the story more unstable. Each detail hinted at something larger, something hidden behind the ordinary face of a restaurant chain that promised comfort and safety. The arches glowed above the highway unchanged, but those who worked beneath them carried the weight of something that refused to reveal itself. The truth may never have been captured fully, but the fragments remained, scattered like broken glass across the floor. And those fragments whispered one haunting idea. The mystery was not an accident, not a malfunction, not a trick of the mind. It was deliberate. Something in the walls, in the floors, in the very silence of the building itself wanted to be noticed, and it had found a way to be seen. Fear spreads quietly, not always through screams or sudden panic, but through small changes that linger in silence. For the employees who worked the night shifts at the restaurant, the strange disturbances did not fade with the rising sun. They carried the weight of what they felt into their homes, into their sleep, into the fabric of their daily lives. At first it appeared as exhaustion. They moved slower, their voices strained, their eyes rimmed red from restless nights. But soon the signs deepened into something more permanent. One worker admitted she no longer slept in her bedroom. After her shift, she would lie awake listening for sounds that should not be in her apartment. The hum of a soda machine, the faint clatter of a tray falling somewhere in the dark. She told herself it was only memory, her mind repeating the sound she heard all night. Yet sometimes she swore the noises grew louder, closer, as though the restaurant itself followed her home. She slept on her couch with the lights on, afraid that if she closed her eyes in the dark, she would open them to find herself not in her home at all, but back in the cold dining room with the empty booths. Another worker quit without notice after a night that left him shaking. He never explained what happened, only that he could not stay in a place where the air felt alive. Friends said he became quiet, withdrawn, rarely leaving his house. When pressed, he whispered that he sometimes saw the reflection of the restaurant in his windows, even though his home was miles away. He claimed that if he looked too long, he could see someone moving inside the reflection, someone waiting. For those who continued working, the fear shaped every decision. They never entered the freezer alone. They spoke to one another constantly while cleaning, filling the silence with nervous words because silence felt dangerous. Some refused to look into the glass doors at night, afraid of what might stare back. They laughed less, and when they did, the laughter was brief, cut short by the thought that perhaps something else was listening. The emotional strain bled into the community. Customers who encountered strange moments carried their own scars. A woman who had taken her young child for a late meal said she could not forget the feeling of someone standing behind her as she ordered. She turned, expecting to see another customer, but the line was empty. The sensation was so strong that she pulled her child close and left without waiting for the food. She admitted later that she still dreams of that moment, of the weight of eyes pressed against her back. Others described a growing paranoia. A man who stopped every night for coffee confessed that he began to dread the drive-thru. He said the voice that came through the speaker did not always sound human, though the words were ordinary. He spoke of a tone that carried something hollow, as if the person on the other end spoke not with lungs but with something deeper. He started avoiding the restaurant, but he still woke some nights convinced he heard that voice echoing in his room. Psychologists explained the symptoms as stress, a collective reaction to long hours and fatigue. But even if the mind created the terror, the impact was no less real. People trembled in their cars before walking through the doors. Employees cried in the bathrooms, afraid to step back into the dining room. More than one worker admitted to praying silently during the shift, asking for protection from something they could not name. It was not the ordinary fear of crime or violence. It was something colder, a fear that grew from within, convincing them that they were no longer safe in a place they should have trusted. The atmosphere of the restaurant itself seemed to reflect this decay. The colors that once looked warm in daylight appeared harsh at night, too sharp, too artificial, like paint stretched over something rotten. The cheerful music that played through the speakers became unbearable, each note clashing against the silence that pressed in from every corner. Even the smell of food turned sour, a heavy sweetness that lingered in the air like a reminder of something spoiled. The emotional toll was not limited to individuals. It spread like a sickness across shifts. Employees began warning new hires about the night shift, not with laughter but with quiet seriousness. Customers whispered to one another about what they felt but never said too much aloud, as if speaking the truth might invite more of it. The building carried an invisible weight that pressed down on everyone who entered. The most haunting effect was the loss of certainty. Workers who once trusted their senses no longer believed them. They questioned every sound, every reflection, every movement in the corner of their vision. They began to doubt themselves, unsure if they were seeing what was real or what the building wanted them to see. That kind of doubt eats at the mind, hollowing it slowly until nothing feels safe. The restaurant was no longer a workplace, no longer a place of routine, but a stage where reality bent just enough to feel unstable. Some described it as paranoia. Others called it despair. But the truth was more complicated. It was the erosion of trust, the slow unraveling of a human being's sense of place and safety. And once that unraveling began, it did not end when the shift was over. It followed them into their cars, their homes, their dreams. It whispered in the spaces between thoughts, reminding them that the arches still glowed, that the building still waited, that something inside remained unfinished. The impact was not measured in screams or headlines, but in quiet destruction. A person who no longer laughed. A child who refused to eat there again. A worker who walked away from the job but carried the fear forever. The restaurant fed the town, but it also consumed them piece by piece until no one could say exactly what had been taken, only that something had been lost. When the stories spread beyond the workers and the late-night customers, the questions began. Everyone wanted answers, but the answers never agreed. Explanations multiplied, each more unsettling than the last, and none of them strong enough to silence the fear. The official accounts were always the simplest. Management claimed that the disturbances were caused by electrical issues. Flickering lights, malfunctioning cameras, random noises from machines left running too long. They assured staff that nothing out of the ordinary was happening, that the building was safe. Yet even they could not explain why the freezer doors sometimes swung open after being locked, or why drive-through speakers activated when the monitors showed no cars outside. They blamed faulty wiring, aging systems, or prank calls. But those who lived through the nights were not convinced. Police reports added another layer. From time to time, officers were called to investigate suspicious activity. Usually it was a frightened worker insisting that someone was inside the dining room after hours. Each time the officers found nothing. No forced entry, no hidden intruder, no signs of damage. One officer wrote in his report that the atmosphere inside felt strange, but the word hung in the report without explanation, vague and unfinished. Another admitted privately that he disliked entering the restaurant at night, though he never explained why. Rumors of trespassers became one theory. Some believed that people were sneaking into the restaurant through side doors, hiding in the restrooms or the play area to frighten staff. But this theory crumbled under closer look. The alarms never triggered and the doors showed no sign of tampering. More importantly, the events repeated across too many nights too consistently for intruders to explain. Footsteps were heard in the hallway even when police stood inside the building. Chairs moved in front of witnesses who swore no one touched them. Human trespassers could be caught. These presences were never caught. As rational explanations failed, darker theories rose. Locals began whispering that the restaurant was haunted, that the land beneath it carried an old wound. Some pointed to stories of farmland fires and missing people from decades before. Others told of a robbery in the early years of the town, when a small diner stood on the same lot and a worker vanished during the night shift. The body was never found. The whispers suggested that the spirit of the missing had remained, bound to the space, appearing again beneath the glow of the arches. But the accounts did not align neatly with a single ghost story. The voices did not always sound the same. The reflections in the windows were not of one person, but many. Some figures looked like children, others like adults, their faces always blurred, as if reality refused to fix them in place. This raised another theory. Perhaps it was not one spirit, but something older, something that fed on presence itself. The restaurant, always open, always lit, became a beacon for whatever drifted in the shadows of night. Paranormal investigators who heard the stories described the building as a liminal space, a threshold that blurred the line between ordinary life and whatever lay beyond. They argued that places that never sleep often attracted energies that did not rest, that the constant cycle of strangers passing through created a kind of echo chamber for spirits. Some went further, suggesting that the sterile light, the endless hum of machines, the repetition of routine created an environment that drew in something unnatural. In their words, the building itself had become a vessel, a cage for things invisible. Skeptics remained unconvinced. They pointed to exhaustion, stress, and suggestion. A worker hears footsteps, another repeats the story, and soon everyone believes the footsteps are real. Fear multiplies itself and the mind betrays its own senses. Yet the skeptics could not dismiss the physical traces. Handprints on the doors, objects moved, receipts smeared with strange markings. Fear might bend the mind, but it should not bend reality. A more disturbing theory grew in silence, spoken only in hushed tones. Some wondered if it was not the building that was haunted, but the people themselves. If the land carried something hungry, perhaps those who entered brought pieces of it home. This explained why workers dreamed of the restaurant long after leaving, why customers felt watched even in their own bedrooms. Perhaps the restaurant was not simply a location but a doorway, one that opened for anyone who stepped through. If that was true, then the danger did not stay confined within the bright walls of the dining room. It followed. Conspiracies also emerged, darker and less supernatural. A few suggested that the chain knew more than it admitted. Why else keep certain restaurants open 24 hours, even when the business was not strong enough to support it? Was there something useful in having these buildings lit at all hours? Something beyond commerce? The theory claimed that the lights were not for customers but for something else, a ritual of constant illumination to contain whatever lurked inside. If the lights ever went out, perhaps the walls would no longer hold. Each theory conflicted with the next, but all of them carried the same core. No one believed the restaurant was ordinary. No one believed the disturbances were accidents. The details were too sharp, the fear too real. Whether the cause was human, spiritual, or something stranger, the truth remained buried beneath layers of silence. The arches glowed, the doors stayed open, and the nights continued. In the end, the investigations left more questions than answers. The police stopped responding with urgency, claiming that nothing serious had ever been found. Management dismissed the stories as exaggerations. Paranormal investigators packed their equipment and left, unable to capture proof strong enough to silence doubt. And yet the stories did not stop. The theories multiplied, unsettled and unresolved, each one feeding the fear that grew with every night. Perhaps the truth lies not in one explanation but in the unease itself. Perhaps the building thrives on uncertainty, on the endless cycle of questions without answers. Theories keep the story alive and the story keeps the fear alive, and the arches continue to glow above the highway, a symbol not only of comfort, but of a mystery that refuses to fade. The glow of the arches still burns above the highways, bright enough to be seen from miles away. To most people, they are nothing more than a familiar sign, a promise of food, light, and routine. Yet for those who have lived through the midnight hours inside, the arches no longer represent comfort. They represent something else entirely, something that feeds on routine, hides inside familiarity, and waits in silence for those too tired or too trusting to notice. What unsettles most is not what has been seen, but what remains unseen. Stories have scattered across towns like seeds carried by the wind, chairs moving without sound, voices whispering names, reflections caught in glass where no one should be. None of these stories ever reach a conclusion. No intruder is ever caught. No shadow is ever explained. No truth ever rises to the surface. Instead, there is only the lingering sense that the story continues, that it has no ending, that the building itself is still writing it in silence. It is this lack of closure that haunts the mind. Human beings are wired to seek answers, to explain, to categorize, to close the door on what they fear. But when the answers never come, the fear does not fade. It deepens. It grows in the cracks of doubt, in the quiet moments when a worker turns the key in the lock and swears that someone is standing behind them. It lingers in the homes of former employees who wake to the sound of machines that are not there, who dream of dining rooms bathed in white light, of booths that are never truly empty. The question becomes larger than a single restaurant. If one place can feel this way, if one building can press this weight against those inside it, how many others exist unnoticed? How many bright, ordinary spaces hide a darkness that is never spoken about? How many voices are whispered into the static of headsets across the country? How many shadows pass unseen across the sterile walls of night shift lobbies? And how many people have already carried something of those places home, without ever realizing it? Perhaps the most disturbing truth is the ordinariness of it. McDonald's was never meant to be extraordinary. It was meant to be safe, predictable, identical no matter where you traveled. But maybe that sameness is what makes it fertile ground for fear. There is something disarming about stepping into a space that looks exactly like the one you visited last week, or last year, in another city altogether. Familiarity lowers the guard. Routine softens suspicion. And in that quiet space of trust, something else may find a way to slip in unnoticed. The stories that survive do so because they are not loud. They are quiet, patient, whispered between workers or confessed by customers who never return. They are not tales of violent ends or dramatic scenes, but of moments that unsettle the core of a person. A voice that should not exist. A reflection that should not appear. A weight that should not press against your chest when you are standing in an empty room. That is why they endure, because they are small enough to be real, sharp enough to carve themselves into memory, and vague enough to never be proven false. There is no final revelation here. No proof strong enough to silence every skeptic. No evidence clean enough to define the mystery. Instead, there is only the continuing presence of the arches themselves glowing every night, drawing in the weary, the hungry, and the restless. They enter seeking food and leave carrying a question they cannot put into words. Why did the dining room feel so heavy? Why did the reflection not match reality? Why did the voice sound hollow, as though spoken from somewhere far beneath the earth? The mystery remains open, and perhaps that is the truest horror of all. There will never be a neat ending, never a closed case file or a solved haunting. The stories will keep coming. New workers, new customers, new fragments of unease. And each fragment will only add to the weight of the silence that has already taken root inside the walls. So the next time you pass the arches late at night, consider the light that spills across the parking lot. Consider the dining room inside, bright and empty, its booths waiting, its machines humming. Ask yourself if someone is sitting there even when you cannot see them. Ask yourself if you would know the difference between a room that is empty and a room that is pretending to be empty. And if you decide to step inside, listen carefully. Do not trust the silence. Do not trust the reflections. And above all, do not assume you are alone, because perhaps you are not. Perhaps you never were.